Hello, we bring you another episode of Budget Podcast. Budget is Nigeria's foremost civic tech organization leading the advocacy for transparency and accountability in the country. This is the space where we have conversations about governance, transparency and accountability, citizens and institutional engagement in Nigeria. I remain your host, Nancy Odimego. Well, we started a conversation in our last episode on demanding budget reform for resource optimization. And we had our discussants, Abel Akeni, the head of research and policy advisory for budget. We equally had Vayala Kwaga, senior research and policy analyst. Well, good news is I have both of my discussants here with me in this new episode. Abel and Vayala, good to have you on the show today.
Thanks for having us, Nancy.
Thank you, Nancy, for having us.
So previously, we looked at some of the key trends in Nigeria's budget. We also touched debt servicing and how sustainable it is borrowing more funds to sustain the budget. We also threw more light on options which the government have for expanding the revenue. We equally discussed having a corruption-proof budget document, as well as the possibility of having a budget that reflects the revenue strength without depending on borrowing. So for today's episode, we'll be delving straight into the sectorial analysis. Now, in the document that was published by Budget, you highlighted the education sector, the health sector, agriculture, transportation, and works, as well as security. But our focus today would be on security. Let me take an excerpt from the document. It says here that the security sector was allocated 1.97 trillion naira in the 2021 annual budget, up from 1.78 trillion naira in the 2020 annual budget to combat insecurity as farmers, herdsmen clashes, kidnapping, insurgency, and robberies. So, from what I can deduce, there was an increase from 2020 allocation for security in the 2021 budget. Now, let's have Abel go first. Between 2015 and 2021, over 10 trillion naira have so far been budgeted for security. With zero accountability on actual spending. With this, do you think the lack of accountability reflects the current high crime rates as well as insecurity being experienced in the country today?
Thank you, Nancy, for that question. So I would say yes, quite a lot has been allocated to the security sector. However, I wouldn't say those allocations directly reflect the high crime rates, largely because there are a multitude of factors that feed into what causes the crime rate in a country to soar. However, one will expect that with that volume of allocations to the security sector, including all the different agencies responsible for domestic security and all, one would expect that with that volume of allocations, there should have been some handle. The government should have been able to have a handle on some of the crises going on in the northeast, in the Niger Delta, and several other regions of the country. So our largest concern is that are Nigerians getting value for money from that allocation that has been made to security expenditures? And let's keep in mind, our analysis doesn't exactly capture certain expenditures that have been made for security from the excess crude accounts. There have been times when the government had withdrawn money from the excess crude account for purchase of, I think at some point, Tucano jets, then at some point for purchasing equipment for the army to fight Boko Haram. So all to fight security. All of that is not captured in what we calculated as the allocations. But what we are saying is that this allocation is huge, and it doesn't in any way justify the high volume or the high rate of crime we have. So are there leakages happening from our security spending and from our weapon bases? Are there leakages happening to criminal elements in the country? No one knows for sure. But what we do know is that huge amounts of money are being spent on security, but this is not translating to a safer Nigeria for every man on the street. So this is a big concern for us, and it's the main reason why we are calling on the federal government to investigates and audits security spendings across the country. What have these monies been used for? Have they been used for the purposes they were intended? The government needs to do a proper audit, and if there were infractions and if there were leakages, the government needs to be swift to take actions on them. The reason is that security is such a delicate aspect of our national lives that once there are leakages from the budget, either to criminal elements or to private pockets, you never can tell the level of destabilizations those criminal elements can wreak on the country. And at that point, Nigeria will no longer have a monopoly of violence because there is so much money filtering into the hands of multiple criminal elements. And the responsibility rests on the government to essentially, or the federal government itself, that's President Buhari, His Excellency, it rests on him to actually call for this audit, because if you look at several aspects of our laws, take the Procurement Act as an example. The Procurement Act basically excludes all forms of purchases for security, ammunition and the like. It excludes them from procurement audits, except there is an explicit consent from the president to carry out those audits. So what we are saying is that the government needs to ensure that there is a procurement audit for all security expenditures so that citizens can rest assured that they got value for money from the allocations that have been made to the security sector so far.
So let me go over to Viola over there. Now, Abel mentioned investigate and audit security spending across the country, and that's on the part of the government. If we have this investigation and auditing already on ground, the document mentioned having over 117 federal agencies receiving allocations worth 24 billion naira on security votes, despite having separate allocations for security charges. If these investigations are already on ground, can we make a justifiable case for security votes as well as the current patterns of its allocation?
Thank you, Nancy, for that question. Abel made some fantastic points. I would build on them in my response.
Okay.
So the answer to that is yes, you can always make a justified case for security votes. Just like you mentioned, security is a delicate issue that, if made too public, will literally inform the various criminal elements it is trying to fight. But at the same time, it means that it is subject or liable to enormous abuse simply because of that lack of transparency. So this goes back to what I said during our last podcast. What is the essence of government? Why does a government exist? What kinds of questions and engagements should we be having with our state governors? What kinds of discussions should the president have with his ministers and the heads of agencies? My colleague seems to give the government a pat on the back every now and then. I am of a different view. I don't think I can give the government a pat on the back yet, because they have monopoly of coercion. They have monopoly of violence. They are the state. So if they have that much power, they have to have a lot of responsibility demanded from them, especially in situations of security, especially regarding the lives and existence of this state called Nigeria and the citizens that constitute this state. So I will say that you can make a case for security spending, but there has to be a discussion around just how that security spending will be audited, because it does have to be audited. Now, this brings me to the critical role of leadership and the kind of legacy Nigerian leaders want to leave for the country and even as themselves, the kind of memory they want to leave in the minds of Nigerians. Just what kind of state do we want to create for ourselves? At the rate at which we're going, there may not be a state at the end of the day if we do not tell ourselves these hard questions. It's one thing to have an audit done. It's another thing to implement the audit. And this brings us back to the issue of politics. You can talk about how a system ought to operate, but if you do not talk about the incentives for various political actors to do, in quotes, the right thing, if you do not talk about the incentives that should exist in the Nigerian civil service for civil servants to actually carry out executive functions with value for money in mind, with transparency in mind, then Nigeria will just continue to exist, as it has been existing.
Okay, you said there is a justifiable case for the security votes. We're going with the current pattern as well as its allocation. But what can be done? What can the federal government do better regarding disbursements, regarding spending, as well as audits in the security sector? Abel.
So I think what they can do is to implement checks and balances. That's the very first thing that the government needs to do, because once you have civil servants and people in the public service, politicians, who see that there is the absence of rule of law, who see that there is the absence of any degree of accountability, you would have more people attempting to game the system quickly and make quick funds off the backs of of tax-paying citizens. So the government needs to step up and implement checks and balances. There is a provision for procurement audits. The president needs to be seen to be insisting that all security expenditures should be audited, even if that will be kept private from the public. I mean, the appropriate committees in the National Assembly should be aware of the procurement audits, the presidency should be aware, but the mere knowledge that they are conducting those types of audits would serve as a deterrent to others, because they will think twice before they try to carry out certain before they carry out any infractions. So I think that's one point I'll make. Another reason or another way another thing we can do better is basically to isolate certain people who have been identified to be involved in several types of infractions, isolate several MDAs, and make an example of those ones, or issue words of cautions to those ones as a warning to other MDAs. Now, the document we highlighted that 117 different federal agencies now have allocations for security votes. That is an aberration. There is no justification on earth why those agencies, many of whom are not even security related agencies, and they have security votes. So even if they want to make a case that money is for some sort of security for their facilities, a lot of them also have provisions for security charges to cover those types of expenses. So you've seen a situation where, because there's an absence of consequences, there's an absence of accountability, more MDAs are encroaching and taking advantage of several loopholes that they have perceived in the budget. So the government needs to step up, block these loopholes, introduce checks and balances. In that way, we would have relative sanity in the disbursements and spending of security allocations. Otherwise, if we continue like this, what the country will continue to experience is the sprouting of what we call conflict entrepreneurs, which is basically people who subtly perpetuate the existence of conflicts just so that they can allow certain funds flow in their direction. Okay. So if there is no accountability, this is where the country is going to head to. You would have multiple conflicts springing up across the entire 36 states. Now we have conflicts across more than 25 states, and the Nigerian army is already spread too thin, and which is why the government needs to intervene very early. The root cause of some of the insecurity we see is the looseness with which money can make its way out of the security budget without checks and balances. So that's something that needs to be urgently addressed. So once people see that this president is serious enough to hold the Nigerian army accountable, to hold the security,
fire a minister, to dismiss a minister, if that's what it takes, the president has to do it.
So they have to do it, and once the citizens see that the government doesn't have the spine, so to speak, to make that happen, I mean, you embolden a whole lot of other people to toe the same line. Yeah. Look at what we had in Malawi recently during the COVID-19 period, where the president basically fired, I think, a minister for, I think the amount that minister spent in Nigerian terms was so little. Here in Nigeria, we have billions making their way into thin air with zero consequences. But you had a minister who spent COVID-19 funds for an unauthorized trip. I mean, that's amazing, and it sends a message, because about 19 other government officials were also arrested alongside in relation to that incident. So once you take steps like that, you send a message out to other people to beware. But what we have in Nigeria, we don't put out deterrent measures to people who have been identified to commit these infractions. So that's one way to go to improve security spending.
It seems everything boils down to auditing, it boils down to investigating, consequences for action. It boils down to politics. Okay, let's go over to the next phase. The document provided some recommendations. Let's start with Vayala. Let's have some of the recommendations that were captured.
The main, or I guess the first recommendation is just common sense. Plug the loopholes. Abel's recent submission emphasized a lack of consequences. Budget isn't putting out its documents for the first time. We've been publishing data and findings on the budget. Other organizations do the same thing, and a lot of these things simply are not new to anyone. So why do they persist? Why do they keep on happening over and over again? Why are loopholes getting wider and wider? Why are they so big that a man can fit his head through them? It's because there are no consequences for this bad behavior. Now, if a minister were to have the power, say hypothetically, to dismiss a director from the civil service, it's possible that other directors would see that, okay, this person means business. The buck stops at his table, because that minister knows that the president would do the same to him or her if they were found wanting. It takes us back to the role of leadership. Just how much should a leader be able to take until they say, that's enough? The reason why we were elected, the reason why you have a job as a civil servant is not to enrich yourself, but is to carry out a function. It's to make the lives of Nigerians easier. So using the budget office as an example, plugging those loopholes. The episode we had the last time, we talked about budget padding. Yes. We talked about frivolous items. We talked about appearing several times in the budget. Why can't the monitoring and evaluation unit housed within the budget office flag these items? Why can't legislators on the floor of the National Assembly, carrying out their constitutional duty to vet the budget, flag these issues? It's because there are no incentives for them being in cahoots with inflated budgets. Everyone gets a kickback at the end of the day, so a legislator doesn't have the incentive or the reason to say, look, Mr. Executive, or look, Mr. MDA, you cannot smuggle this into the budget because you are stealing from Nigerians. But when the system supports and props up those that do these things, then you cannot expect that same system to magically produce an efficient, effective, equal and fair system of governance or fair governance. It's just not going to happen. So first things first, develop the idea that politics is meant to meet an end that is beneficial for everyone. How do those ends come about? They come about through engaging with politicians. They come about through politicians deciding that they have to put, or they have to stop, or they have to make sure the buck stops at their table before decisions that affect the livelihoods of Nigerians are made.
Thank you for that. So what are the steps budget is taking to resolve some of the identified issues, as Vayala pointed out?
Okay, thank you very much, Nancy, for that. In terms of steps budget is taking, I would say that by and large, budget has done a large part of its role.
Yes.
We have introduced these issues to the public domain. We have kickstarted the conversation and will continue to push the conversation to the desks of the relevant officers. However, there are critical action steps that the government on its own has to take. We have provisions in our laws that can help us redress situations like this. And first example I would give, or first step I think the government can take, is to utilize a very good provision of the Fiscal Responsibility Act for environment. And if we look at the Fiscal Responsibility Act, I think that's section 27 subsection 2. If we look at that act essentially empowers the minister in the overall public interest. You get to request for environments, and what we want to happen, or what we want to see happen, is all the issues or all the projects we have highlighted as duplicated, all the projects that have been highlighted as clearly frivolous, as fraudulent, all those projects should be identified and varied out of the ministries where they occurred, and those amounts of money should be saved and potentially invested in say repairs of our healthcare centers across the country, or providing more schools for out of school children. So the very first step the government can take is to leverage section 27 subsection 2 of the Fiscal Responsibility Act and ensure that all these monies are saved by the end of the year, because we're having these conversations now because the government hasn't started spending on some of these projects. So there is still time to save the situation from getting bad. There's still time to save some of these monies from being stolen. So environment would be the first recommendation we'll put out to say the government on its own part needs to do to complement the effort that budget has done in bringing these issues to the fore. Another thing the government can do, and we've talked about in the past, is to introduce consequences for infractions. So demonstrate that your actions or your policy statements and guidelines are not just paper tigers, that they can indeed bite when the need arises. So, for example, the Budget Office issued a guideline that essentially would have prevented budget padding in 2021 budget. They warned all the MDAs to get not to smuggle recurrent expenditure items into their budget, into their capex budget. But we saw a situation after our analysis that a lot of those MDAs still smuggled recurrent expenditure into their capex. You get, without any consequences at the moment. So if you have issued a guideline, you have identified a problem, you've issued a guideline to solve it, and now your people, the MDAs, did not comply, and you've shown no consequences for non-compliance, rest assured that in subsequent years
it will happen again,
and more people this time will take advantage of it, because they saw that the few that attempted it got away with it. So the second thing we're recommending very strongly is that there should be consequences for infractions of laid down rules and regulations. Another thing the government can do very well is to implement some of its beautiful policies. I mean, this federal government, especially at the Budget Office, there are a lot of intelligent technocrats actually supporting the government. They have put in place a lot of interesting and exciting guidelines, but the government needs the political will to push through and implement these guidelines. One very interesting one I would cite right now is the proposal to introduce GPS coordinates to capital expenditure projects. So we strongly recommend that that's one proposal that the government needs to ensure is implemented, because once we have each capital project with their own unique GPS coordinates, we would have less occurrences. We'll have less occurrences of duplicated projects. Because I know we spoke about it in our last episodes. One very quick occurrence of a duplicated project was, I think, the construction of a bridge across River Rima by the Border Communities Development Agency. And then you had that same project occurring in the Federal Ministry of Environment headquarters. That's the same project, but allocated in two different ministries. Now, if we had a scenario where each of these projects had their unique GPS coordinates, they would not be able to have them duplicated, because the budget system would not accept two projects with the same GPS coordinates. So this is one solution that technocrats working with the government have come up with. What is left right now is for the government to find the political will to implement it. And I mean, this is not me downplaying the scope of work or the amount of work involved in doing this. It's going to be hard work, but it's work that needs to be done. And I say it's hard work because look at the 2021 budget alone. We have over 19,000 capital projects. So if you want to have GPS coordinates for majority of these, it's a lot of hard work you would have to put in place. It's a lot of boots on ground, and it's a lot of hardware equipment you would need to get for a lot of these MDAs for the appropriate GPS coordinate tagging. So there's a lot of work to be done, but the government has the right resources to do it. Last year alone, I think they allocated over 17 billion to monitoring and evaluation, and this year alone, something similar has also been allocated to monitoring and evaluation across all 19,000 projects. So if you have that much money for M&E, it makes sense to devote some of it to implementation of policies like these GPS coordinates that will prevent the occurrence of duplicated projects in the budget. So those are some of the recommendations we'll continue to push to the federal government for implementation, and it is our hope that they would adopt some of them. As I mentioned previously, sometimes when we engage with the government, like we did when the budget was proposed, not all the recommendations the government will agree to. When we flagged several frivolous items, the government did not agree to all of them as frivolous items, but they made some compromises and they made some corrections. And we are hoping that this time around, for the new ones that were the new frivolous items and loopholes for corruption that were inserted into the budget, that they would attempt something similar and make those corrections to the budget.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, this was really interesting. Speaking about environment, the consequences for infraction, so that others would use it as deterrent. And you also spoke about policy implementation and having the political will to actually implement. You said the federal government have beautiful policies, but we are yet to implement them. Well, I believe that if we implement most of what have been highlighted here in the conversation today, I mean, we should have one less problem to worry about in Nigeria today. Well, I'm thankful because I equally got to learn a few things, and I'm sure my listeners have been exposed to some things regarding budget, its reform, maximizing revenues for optimum performance, and moving the nation forward as a whole. Thank you so much, Abel Akeni. Abel is the head research and policy advisory for budget, while Viola Kwaga is a senior research and policy analyst in budget. Thank you. Do you have any last words for our listeners today?
Okay, in terms of last words, I would say if there are government officials listening to this podcast, would encourage them to look at some of these recommendations, largely because it is in their own best interest. When the citizens see that the government is taking the right actions, it builds trust in the government, and it helps to reduce the current trust deficit that we have in the system, and it enlightens the citizens about several issues. And just to buttress my point, take the non-compliance with the Fiscal Responsibility Act to include all expenditures in the Appropriation Act, right? Now, a lot of citizens do not know that the government subsidizes their electricity, but the government has spent over 200 billion per year in the last 3 years subsidizing the electricity you and I use, subsidizing the electricity every Nigerian uses.
The electricity that is being supplied erratically.
So, I mean, it's erratic, but the one that is supplied at all is heavily subsidized. So if you do not quote that amount in the budget, there's no way for citizens to even know that you're making that much investments in their subsidy. So the day you show up that, you are taking away electricity subsidy and electricity prices are going to go out, you are suddenly going to meet with huge resistance from the people, because they essentially think you are lying. They're like, how come, since when did you start paying subsidy?
Why did you not say it before?
Exactly. So it's in the government's own best interest if it complies with certain laws, because it builds trust with the citizens. So thank you very much, Nancy, for having me.
Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, great.
Yes, so thank you so much for that, Abel. Excellent points raised. There are a million and one things I could draw from that, but I would go to a very, very unpopular statement that Governor Kayode Fayemi made at the recently held platform discussion at Igomu. He said something about paying more attention to civil servants, and of course Nigerians were horrified that he would say that. But he's right. The fact that he argues for more attention to be paid to civil servants doesn't mean less attention should be paid to politicians. But he does understand that politicians are elected in 4-year cycles. Civil servants are there in perpetuity till they retire. Yes. So they are the ones that know and understand how government is run, and oftentimes are the ones that actually do the actual administration. What am I saying? They are the ones that do the actual administration in a ministry. So we do need to think deeply about, I know you're going to hate this term, civil service reform. Because if we want to reap the fruits and benefits of governance, then more attention needs to be paid to the executive arm of government, the civil servants, and the incentives and disincentives they have to do their jobs, to commit wrongs, to remain there, or to be asked to leave. So in the coming years, or in the coming weeks, I guess, things are very urgent, we do need to think more deeply about just how the civil service administers the country and plays its role in governance.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you so much, guys, for joining me today. Well, don't forget to send in your comments, observations, and contribution via tweet on our Twitter pages at budgetng, on Facebook budgetng, and on Instagram it's also budgetng. My name is Nancy Odemego. Until next time, to join us again.